All right. Thanks, Camille. My name is Connor Corbett. I'm with Diamond Head Consulting, and today we're going to be giving a kind of a presentation, about a 20 to 25-minute presentation on. Basically, we'll start off with a quick overview of what's happening in the district of North Cowichan in regards to wildfire risk management, and then we'll kind of zero in on one specific subcomponent of that project, which is a fuel management prescription up on Maple Mountain. So I'm Connor Corbett. I'm a registered professional forester, a wildfire specialist, and I've been working with the municipality for the last couple of years on a variety of sort of wildfire risk mitigation projects. Just a little bit of background. Wildfire mitigation in BC is generally done in phases. There's very distinct phases that occur, and this all started about 2 years ago with the Community Wildfire Protection Plan that the District Municipality of North Cowichan completed it was finalized in early 2021. And included within that Community Wildfire Protection Plan were several recommendations for reducing wildfire risk to the municipality. And now that we have that completed, we're following up this year with three discrete different recommendations that were included within the Community Wildfire Protection Plan. And those are fire smart assessments for critical infrastructure, a wildfire development permit area, and 3 fuel management prescriptions. And also kind of linking and overarching all of these different projects is a communications and engagement strategy for those 3 projects. And so that communications and engagement strategy has been a big component that we've been working on for the past few months. And so we have a formal communication strategy that we've worked on with North Cowichan staff. We have a public website, an interactive webpage with lots of detail on all these 3 different projects. And we began open houses at the end of October, and this is part of that series of open houses, and there's going to be several more moving forward. And if you want to have updates on any of these projects, just feel free to go to northcowichan.ca/wildfire, and you'll find our website linked there. And those websites that webpage is continually updated with what's going on and how the projects are kind of unfolding. And so I'm just going to run over some of the project components just really generally so that people are aware of what's going on. The first is critical infrastructure assessments. And so these are 27 North Cowichan owned structures, essentially, that are, the Community Wildfire Protection Plan identified as being potentially vulnerable to wildfires. And so these assessments, which are assessments only, are identifying specific vulnerabilities within or for each structure. So not only is what the structure is made of that might make it vulnerable to wildfire, but the vegetation immediately surrounding that structure. And so we score them using this formalized worksheet that is standardized throughout BC. And using that score, we can identify the hazard and set the stage for interventions to reduce that hazard. And this is something that we're sort of starting to work on right now, but we haven't been focusing on just yet. The second big project component is the wildfire development permit area. And this is essentially a way to reduce wildfire risk in areas that have been identified as having a high vulnerability to wildfire. So generally, these are homes in the interface between development and natural forested areas in the North Cowichan. So there's 2 components to this project. The first is identifying those areas that are going to be of high risk. And the second is developing guidelines for development in those areas so that development happens in a way that is resilient and doesn't increase vulnerability of the whole community to wildfire. These are quite common in British Columbia. Like you can see the visual here. This is the map from the District of North Vancouver. This is the areas in orange and red are areas in their wildfire development permit area. And these wildfire DPAs are used all over British Columbia to reduce wildfire risk. And we're working with district staff to make sure that we come up with appropriate guidelines that fit within the municipality of North Cowichan. And finally, we have our fuel management prescription. So that's what we're going to talk about for the rest of today, and hopefully what all the questions are going to be focused on. And there's 3 candidate areas that were identified in the Community Wildfire Protection Plan, and we are following up on those recommendations to create separate fuel management prescriptions for each area. So we have Mount Zuhalem, an area on Mount Zuhalem, an area on Maple Mountain, and an area adjacent Mount Richards. And these prescriptions are completed to standards and follow a format and process that's standardized by the British Columbia Wildfire Service. At this stage, we've completed the Mount Zuhalem prescription. We had an open house for that about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And if you're interested in more details on that, feel free to check the webpage, and there's a recording of the presentation we completed for that prescription area. And so I'd like to start off by explaining what is fuel management, and then we can talk about what we're doing on Maple Mountain. So essentially, fuel management is this kind of sub-discipline of forestry to reduce wildfire risk in forests. And fuel management prescriptions are a key part of this process by describing how to do this. A fuel management prescription is a document, it's a plan. And when I say fuel management, what we're trying to do is take a high risk forest. So this is an area that we worked on a couple of years ago that was identified as high risk. It's really close to a community on the coasts. It's in a very high recreation area, so it sees a lot of use. It's a very public area. And I'll explain what makes this high risk, hopefully, in this presentation, so you can keep this image in the back of your mind, and hopefully you'll understand what makes some of the components of the forest that made it high risk. But through fuel management, you take a starting forest like this, which is high risk, and you end up with something that might look a little bit like this. This is the exact same forest. It's slightly different area, but as you can see, the characteristics of the forest have been changed. And in fuel management, they were changed to reduce the wildfire risk. And this is in a extremely popular trail use area. You can actually see on the left of the photo, I'm standing on a trail when I took this photo. And the contractors here did a really great job. And I think you'd be hard pressed to most lay people would probably be hard pressed to notice that the work even occurred here. And what's really important to remember is that we're just modifying the forest, but we're keeping a forest there, just a forest that is slightly less flammable or extremely less flammable than what we started with. And so the fuel management prescription, or the plan, is best understood by splitting these three terms up and describing both in detail, and then we can bring them together and you'll understand what fuel management prescriptions are. And the biggest and most important technical term is fuel. So fuel is the word we use in wildfire to describe the organic material that is burning in a wildfire. So if you think about when you have your candle that's burning, the wax is the fuel that's sustaining that fire. Similarly, in a forest fire, it's the organic material is sustaining the fire. So that's things like the tree needles, the logs on the ground, the branches, the moss, the organic material even in the soil. All these things burn in wildfires. And the way this vegetation is what it's composed of and the way it's arranged is what drives the level of flammability. And that's really, really important because we have a lot of different types of forests in the world and in BC, and they all have very different degrees of flammability. And it varies based on the arrangement and the composition. So these are the 5 kind of general characteristics we're looking at for high flammability forests. And the number one thing to think about is there's 5 different things to think about. And we want to think about how much fuel there is, how much vegetation there is, how much biomass is available for a wildfire. We want to think about how continuous between the vertical fuel layers, how much continuity there is. So if a tree's branches and needles extend all the way down to the forest floor, there's a lot of continuity there vertically. And we also want to think about the horizontal continuity. So if it's a really dense forest full of Christmas trees that are all touching each other, that's a lot of horizontal continuity. We want to think about the dead fuel that's in the forest, because dead trees and dead logs are usually much drier, especially if they're elevated off the forest floor, and that makes them more flammable. And finally, we want to think about how much conifer fuel there is. So conifer is those are types of trees that have needles, Christmas trees, and they're much more flammable than deciduous trees, which are have leaves on them like maples and oaks and things like that. And to kind of keep us sort of grounded in the coast and the area we're working in, and these things I've highlighted in red, the text in red, these are the characteristics we typically see in the forests of North Cowichan and the areas surrounding North Cowichan. So there's a tremendously high volume of fuel. These are some of the most productive ecosystems in Canada. So there's a huge amount of vegetation and biomass available for wildfires. There's a ton of continuity within the horizontal layers because there's not a ton of topographic breaks in a lot of the forests. And so in a lot of areas, it's just continuous forest. And then finally, it's a high proportion of conifer fuel. Almost all the forests here naturally tend to be coniferous forests, mostly of Douglas fir or cedar in this ecosystem. And so those are the 3 characteristics that really jump out to us when we're working in the North Cowichan. And our next term, when we're talking about fuel management prescriptions, is management. So wildfire risk is driven by a number of factors, and the most important ones are the fuel, which we just discussed, the terrain. So if it's steeper or south-facing, it's generally going to have more, it's going to be more flammable. The weather, obviously we need it to be hot and dry and windy for there to be wildfires. And the location, so how close is this forest to the things that we don't want to burn? And when you think about those physical characteristics, it's pretty evident that the only one we can change reasonably is fuel, is to reduce the flammability of the forest. And management is how we do that. We alter the composition and arrangement of fuel to reduce the flammability. There are many ways to do this, and all depend on the type of fuel and ecology we have there. And so the prescription is what makes that site specific, and that's what makes our management site specific. And that's important because the strategies we have a number of different strategies to reduce flammability, but we have to make them site specific. We have to make sure what we're doing works in the ecosystem that we're working in. And so our prescription takes the principles of fuel management and makes them site specific. So it lays out the objectives for wildfire risk reduction and strategies to achieve those. So we want them to be specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely or time sensitive. But when we're thinking about wildfire risk, we also want to make sure we're managing the other important values in the area, such as trails, recreational values, different biodiversity values, and different other important values that are present in the forest that we don't want to damage through our treatment. And I'm just gonna have to take a quick pause here. Camille, if you want to just step in for a second. I just have to plug in my computer. My battery just started dying.
Yeah, not a problem at all. And we've had a few folks, in fact, join us in the last couple of minutes as Connor was getting through a presentation. So again, thanks for all of you who are joining us in the room. Essentially, we're partway through Connor's presentation. So for folks who may have attended the last event, the first few slides may have sounded familiar, but we're just about to get into the Maple Mountain specific section of this presentation, which hopefully will give you more information about the prescription. And then right after the presentation, we'll be doing a question and answer period. So feel free, if you have any questions that come up during the presentation, to write them in the chat or to keep them for after Connor's presentation.
Perfect. Thanks for filling those newcomers in, Camille. And so, yeah, the Maple Mountain Fuel Management Prescription is where we're going to be making that prescription for a specific area. And so this is kind of a map of the zoomed out area that we're looking at. This is a whole overview of Maple Mountain. And sort of in the bottom right, you can see circled in red is our little treatment area. So this is an area of elevated wildfire risk that was identified in the Community Wildfire Protection Plan. And it's inside the Municipal Forest Reserve. And it surrounds critical infrastructure. So there's a communications infrastructure at the top of Maple Mountain that we want to protect through this fuel management prescription. And this is just a photo I took that's fairly typical of a lot of the area up there. And if you can recall sort of the characteristics of high risk forests and kind of think about them within the context of this image, the thing that really jumps out is that there's quite a bit of material on the ground here. And that's kind of the big picture. What we're focusing on in this prescription is just managing the amount of debris that's present on the ground here and reducing the surface fuels. And so thereby reducing the horizontal continuity of those surface fuels. And here's a zoomed in map of the area that we're going to be working in. And so the total area of this is about 4.8 hectares. So that's quite small for a fuel management area in general. And you can see we're sort of using, there's an existing road we're following for one of the boundaries, and we're kind of wrapping around where the communications tower is. And just to kind of summarize the big picture things that we're doing here, like I said, we're going to be reducing the surface debris, and that's going to be a bulk of the work that occurs here. And then we're also recommending thinning of dead and smaller trees, and then protecting the larger trees. And there's going to be pretty low volume removal, because we're protecting the large trees where most of that volume is kept, but we are going to be removing a lot of the understory trees, which are mostly quite small. And so in terms of numbers of trees that are getting removed, it's much higher than the volume number will give you, but the volume is very low. And the work is going to be a mix of machine and ground-based. And that's pretty typical of prescriptions. You usually require machinery to help you aid with the debris management. And then a lot of the work is done by workers on foot because they're more easily able to maneuver around those big trees that we're going to be keeping without damaging them. And then again, our wildfire risk reduction objectives. So we do have to follow the British Columbia Wildfire Service criteria to make sure that the public is safe, and then also that their firefighters are safe if they have to go in there in the event of a wildfire. And we quantify that using some fairly sophisticated software modeling that is also standardized through the BC Wildfire Service. And the whole idea is to reduce the likelihood of severe wildfire under peak wildfire conditions. And in addition to the wildfire risk reduction goals, we also have our what we call our sensitivity. So these are the things that we want to make sure our prescription is sensitive to and is preventing any damage occurring to. So one of the things is that this is a very popular public recreation area. There's 2 mountain bike trails that run through the prescription area. So we have within our prescription provisions to make sure that those trails aren't impacted. Most of those trails are actually in areas that there's not a ton of work required to do, so there won't be a lot of conflict between the trails and the work. In terms of visuals, which is another common value that's sensitive in these areas, we're keeping most of the big trees. So there will be a very small, I would say it would be very difficult to even see any of the alteration that we're doing in this area. And then in terms of sort of biodiversity sensitivities, we're in a sensitive ecosystem. And so to that end, I work with a registered professional biologist to make sure that what we're doing makes sense with the broader biodiversity goals for this area, and making sure that we're respecting the sensitivity of that ecosystem, make sure it continues functioning. And then I included road construction here because road construction is often one of the most impactful things that happens in this work. And fortunately for us, there is a developed road network. We won't require any road construction. We'll likely require an access trail to get the material out, but that's one of those things that we have to work on with the contractor. But generally what we do is we set very strict limitations on the amount of disturbance they can have with this work, and we leave that with them, and that's one of their requirements when they take our prescription and implement it. And so in conclusion, just kind of wrapping up, tying this in with the bigger picture of wildfire risk mitigation, the Zuhalan prescription is complete, and it's proposed for treatment in 2022. And what that means is that Maple Mountain would have to occur in subsequent years. It's not planned on being implemented before then. It would most likely, the earliest would be 2023, but that's sort of something that we're working on with North Cowichan. The remaining wildfire mitigation work is ongoing. If you're interested in any of the other projects, I recommend you join us for other open houses and check our website. And yeah, there's quite a few more events that are scheduled and occurring in the upcoming months, and I hope to see people there at those meetings. And thank you so much for paying attention to the presentation. I hope people have some questions.